Hello, everyone. Welcome to the July 2012 Professor Messer Network Plus Study Group. This is our monthly study group meeting where we get together and talk about the questions that you've sent in over the last month or so, things that you'd like to know about the Network Plus exam. Plus, we have some other news about what's going on with the Network Plus and some of the other certification exams in general. And I'd like to throw a few extras in from time to time as well. Thanks for joining us. My name is James Messer. If you would like to join us live, you can check the calendar on the Professor Messer website at professormesser.com/calendar. And of course, if you want to join us live anytime we're having one, you can go to professormesser.com/live. There will also be links on the calendar. If you'd like to register and send me a message that has a question in it, you can do it that way. I also send you an update message before we actually get started so that you're able to get a little notice in your inbox that something is about to happen. It's kind of nice. And of course, I tweet it out and hit Facebook and Google+, so you're aware of it that way as well. I am also going to throughout this presentation, take questions from the chat room. And there are actually two chat rooms I'm watching. There are 24/7. There are chat rooms on the bottom of the Professor Messer website. You can go in there at any time of the day and ask a question. If someone's around, they can help you out with that. And I like to hang out in that one as well. I am also watching the chat that we do from our live stream that is on justin.tv. And that live stream chat is also on my screen. So as long as you are watching one of those, you will be able to see what's going on with those pieces. So as we step through this, I'd like everyone to know that some of the things that we are doing with our A+ study group is getting your questions and answering them. But we could not do this if I was not able to get your support by just watching the videos. It provides me with support and keeps the website going. Some of you like to get the videos and take them offline, and I have offline versions for you that you could purchase. They're on DVD-ROMs. You can put them into your computer. I've got HD versions. There's MP3s that you can put on a mobile device. If you want to see more about those, you can find them at professormesser.com/download-network plus, and you can learn all about that piece as well. This, as an update, though, I'd like to let you know, of course, that the 005 exam, the N10005, was one that was released in December, this past December, a number of months ago, about half a year. And when that came out, they said, guess what? We've got this new exam. It's the 005. The old exam is the 004. The 004 exam is going to go away eventually. And now that it's been a number of months, this eventuality is now coming to fruition. We've now got on August the 31st. We're now doing this at the end of July. So you've basically got one more month to be able to take the 004 exam. Now, the 004 exam at that point goes away completely. So if you have been studying for the 004 exam, it's going away completely. You have to get your exam done by August the 31st. That's when it goes away completely. And at that point, your only choice will be able to take the 005 exam. So keep that in mind if you are studying towards your 004, that's going away. And there's some new things in the 005. If you want to look at what's new in the 005, at the top of the freenetworkplus.com webpage, which is where my video index is for the 005 exam, there's a little link at the top that says, look at the differences between 004 and 005. It takes you to an older replay of a Network Plus study group we did, and right to the point where it starts to talk about what the differences are, because I take you through every section and tell you what those differences are. Even now, I'm getting questions that are coming in during the month that say, what is the difference between these different exams? I want to know what's going on there. You can, of course, go out and find out more about those. And I've got a link that tells you all about what you need to know. So even if you have been studying for the 004, what you'll find is the 005 is just a slightly updated version. There are no dramatic changes. It is not a radical departure from the 004. I think you'll probably do just fine if you want to even transition on to take the 005 exam. Of course, you get the same certification. Doesn't matter which one you take. You'll be able to look at both of those. Can't really lose there. You will absolutely be able to take the same certification. You get the same piece of paper, whether you take the 004 or the 005. So that's very, very useful as well. If you already have your Network Plus certification, You can watch this and actually get credits for your continuing education. That's one of the things that you would like to be able to do. The continuing education units is something if you'd like to accumulate credits and use those credits towards renewing your Network Plus certification, because of course it expires in 3 years. Some people don't even bother with continuing education credits. They're simply going to take a higher level certification exam and pass that, which will automatically renew a Network Plus, and in fact, automatically renew an A Plus if you happen to have that as well. So there's some things to think about. If you don't want to go down the road of doing continuing education credits, you don't have to do that either. So just something to keep in mind, and you can actually get credits for watching all of this. As I mentioned, you send me questions. So you send me a lot of information about what's going on with the questions you're running into. I watch the chat that's on the bottom of the Professor Messer website. I look at questions that are sent to me on Facebook. I look at things coming across Twitter, and I just run across things during the month. And I think that would be an interesting question for the study group. And I stick it in my notes, and then we're able to do that as well. So I'm going to go through these questions, get a feel for what you're doing. But first, I have an interactive view that I'd like to do, because I have a certain topic I'd like to cover. But one of the questions that I'd like to know about is what you are doing from an interviewing perspective. This is one of those things where you're getting a certification, and many of you ask me questions about the interviewing process. So I thought it might be interesting to see what types of, or how many people are actively interviewing right now, looking for a job, especially around technology, because that interests me a bit. If you'd like to respond to this, you can go to vote.rs, that's VOT.rs, and you can go to the number 25109 to be able to respond to this particular question. So here is the 25109. I'm just going to leave this up and let us see what's there. One thing, by the way, if I go back to my slide real quick, one thing about this actively interviewing process, I want to be able to know just where you are in the world with the interviewing process, being able to know if this is something that you are doing. Maybe interviewing is not really the forte of what you're working on right now. Maybe you just like to get through the certification process yet. Maybe interviewing is not. But I have so many people asking about this during the week. I thought I'd ask the people who are watching it live, are you in the process of doing interviewing? A few people that are able to get in there and respond are telling me, no, we're good right now. We're not really looking for that new job yet. But one of the things that we always notice when we get a certification is we're looking to go to a different position. Sometimes we can do that within our own organizations, but of course, sometimes you have to leave one existing company, go to a completely different company to be able to really make the jump and make the change of a career that you would like, especially when you're getting into networking. You get into networking, there's very different when you go from something like a help desk position or a server management position. You want to get into networking, it may require that you go somewhere else. And so one of the things I looked at this week, and one of the things that we ran across, there was a dialogue going on in the chat room on the Professor Messer website about answering questions when you're going through a type of conversation with somebody during an interview. And this brings up so many interesting things to me because I've interviewed a lot of people. I've been in director positions. I've been in senior director positions where I've had people come in and I need to hire them for a network position, for a security position, for a help desk position. And I have to ask questions of them to find out what would be good. Would you make a good systems engineer? Let me find out. So before we get too deep into the details, I want to talk about interview questions that aren't quite the best interview questions. And you may know what I'm talking about here. These are the questions that are just horrible. They are awful questions. Here's the secret that nobody tells you about interviewing is when you go in to talk to somebody, very rarely is the person you're talking to in an interview ever been trained on how to give an interview. Very rarely. In fact, your boss will come by, drop a resume on your desk, say, go talk to this guy. He just came in. I need you to do an interview. All right, I manage routers and switches. I don't know about this whole interview thing. You have to have a dialogue, have to communicate with somebody. And what do you even ask? Nobody tells you the things to ask. And so you end up getting these horrible questions, these questions that you've been asked, and you think if someone asked it of me, then I should ask it of someone else. It's like a family recipe, but it's of a really bad recipe. It doesn't taste well at all, but you don't know what else to say. So you just keep talking and talking about these bad questions, but you still need to know how to answer them, because you can't just say, you know what, that's a horrible question. Why would you ever ask that of me? Because then you definitely won't get the job. So I wanted to go through one of these today and talk about them. And here's the question: what is your biggest weakness? Now, this is usually asked when you're going through a question of what's your biggest strength. Then they turn around and say, what's your biggest weakness? And here's the secret to this question. Don't answer it. Do not answer literally the biggest weakness. You do not want to tell people, oh, you know what? That's probably not something I'm good at. So let me tell you all the things I'm not good at. Now, don't you want to hire me? Because you've heard all these things that I don't do very well. This is really a question that you answer with your next largest strength, because I'm assuming here they've already asked you what is your biggest strength, and if somebody asks you your biggest strength, you know what the next question is going to be. So nobody is really expecting you to give your biggest strength. In fact, it's almost a trick question. If you give us your biggest weakness, if somebody asks you your biggest weakness, they're not expecting you to really give your biggest weakness. And if you do, they're like, oh, well, you're not really right for this position. It's a bit of a challenge. You should have already talked about what your biggest strength is. So already have in your mind, this is one of these things you have to prepare before you walk in, that what is something that is my next largest strength. So you should have this in your back pocket. I have been asked this question in interviews many times, and I've heard people ask this in interviews many times, and people on my website talk to me about interviews they've been in and talked about this very time. So let's answer the question, and we'll get to some networking stuff. The question is, do not answer, well, I just don't like people. If I had to describe my biggest weakness is that I hate you already. Probably not the way you should start a conversation. Or, I have a car and it doesn't work very well, so I'm always late. I really have a problem with that. Tardiness is just in my blood. It's part of my DNA. So that's my biggest weakness. That's not where you want to go either. Your question, the answer to this question instead should be something like, well, I'm always challenged with time management. So here are the things that I do to make sure that all of my projects end on time, or to make sure that everything I should be doing during the work week is starting and ending at exactly the right time. Notice how you turn that around. Everybody has a challenge with time. There's never enough time in the day. The meetings always go late. You have projects that have deadlines. This is a universal truth. That's a perfect example of how you should answer that question. Or another one, I always find it hard to manage multiple projects simultaneously. A lot of us are very, very focused on one thing at a time, and we can do one thing at a time. That's a challenge for me as well. So what I've done is implement a mind mapping system, implement a time management system, implement something that deals with projects and how to manage those things. So as you go through the process of getting your Network Plus certification, and you're going out there and you're interviewing and you're on the street and you're talking to people, don't be trapped by some of these interview questions. Give a question that makes you look good. At the end of the day, the interviewer is interested to hear about the projects you've been a part of, the things you've been able to do. You should talk as much as you can about that. In fact, don't give the interviewer much time to ask questions. Just talk a lot about all of the projects you've been involved with, how they apply to what you're interviewing with. That one is really, really helpful when you get in front of somebody, because the interviewer doesn't know what to say anyway. And if you can keep them from asking those bad family recipe questions, you're going to be much better off. You control the interview. You tell the person on the other end of the desk why they should be hiring you, the things you've done in the past. I trust me, it will be much better in the long run if you completely avoid the weakness question and go right to your secondary strength. So let's go through some of the questions you've sent me this week. I'm also looking in the chat room. If you guys have chat requests, if you have questions that come up that you'd like to cover, you can put them in there and I'll see them as we go by as well. One of them talked about the A+. This is our Network Plus study group, but the A+ is also changing. I talked about the Network Plus exam changing. The A+ is as well. CompTIA tends to update their certifications every 3 years, and we've already done that at the end of the year. Was the Network Plus, the A+ in October, they say, is about to change. And eventually Security Plus changed about a year ago. So we've got another couple years for that as well. The Security is really the latest version that's out there so well. But a question I saw come up, and it was an interesting one because we get involved with the intricacies of the Network Plus details. There are a lot of details and a lot of things to memorize. And sometimes there are lines that blur between the different topics. So here's a question that came in. Is Cat6 cable any better or faster than Cat7 cable? I think that's a valid question. Although I would say probably quite assuredly that Cat6 is absolutely faster than Cat7. Anybody care to probably guess why Cat7 might be a lot slower than Cat6? Well, it's because there is no Category 7. They're currently the highest level category is 6. Actually, it's an add-on to the Category 6 that we will look at in just a moment. But this is a question I thought had a good idea about how fast you can put traffic over these cables. The cable itself, of course, isn't really fast at all. Your topology that you put on the cable is what determines the speed. The cable is just a medium that we're using to get data from point A to point B. If there was barbed wire that was running from point A to point B, and we could run 1 gig Ethernet, 100 gigabits per second over barbed wire, that would be the medium that we would use. So don't think so much about that, whatever's in the middle, as determining the speed. It's what the topology supports, what you're plugging into on the ends, that really determines the speed. The medium has to be designed to keep up with that, or to be able to manage the signals going across the fiber or going across the copper that we have there. And there's so many different criteria associated with this, a lot of different criteria. If you were to look at the specifications for Cat5, for Cat6, there are specifications that talk about impedance and capacitance and inductance and the diameter of the wire and how much insulation is inside of that cable. We look at it, it's just a bunch of wires. It doesn't look very complex at all, but it's remarkable how much engineering has gone into that wire, because the engineers know we're going to plug in a gig Ethernet on this side and a gig Ethernet on this side. What do we have to put in the middle to make sure that that noise, that sound, that signal gets from one end of that cable all the way to the other end of the cable? So keep that in mind as you're going through your Network Plus, that you have to know all of these different categories, but the categories really don't determine the speed. The signal determines the speed. The categories ensure that the cable that we will be putting in can support the speeds that we are putting across those cables. Let's look at those options. There's not a lot of options there that we would look at. The options are, for our cable categories, is Category 3. Now, you don't see a lot of Category 3 that is out there in the walls anymore. This has been around a long time, this Category 3. It was one of the first categories that was ever created when we started standardizing on cable. Before this, we were running our token ring networks and our Ethernet networks. We had coax. There really wasn't a pure standardization associated with this. And TIA got together and said, you know what? We need to get together on this, because we're about to have this enormous boom of networking. Everything is going to be networked. Every company is going to have networks. Your house is going to have a network. We need standards. And so they started creating one. Category 3 was one of the first ones we created. This supported, at the time, this was high speed. This was 10 meg Ethernet and 4 megabit per second token ring. This was, at the time, some of the fastest networks that you would find. And so Category 3 fit perfectly for that. So as you're thinking about the memorizing those different categories and what you could do with them, Category 3 works very, very well to think about how I could start thinking about what signals I can send across Category 3. Well, of course, we have faster speeds. We came out with faster networks, and there was a need for cables to be able to support those faster standards. And when the 100 megabit, at the time we called it fast Ethernet, at 100 megabits per second, we needed a better cable. We could not plug into Category 3 and be assured that a 100 megahertz signal would be able to get from one end of the cable to the other. 100 megabit, I think, is running at 100 megahertz. I'm trying to remember off the top of my head. There's a signaling method that's used in there, and it needs to support those frequencies that are going across. So that was an update to Category 3 that allowed us to send that much traffic across the network at the distances that we needed to send it. And that's why we came up with the new category, because it could send that signal. Now, of course, you could still send 10 meg Ethernet across that link. If you had token ring connections, they could use category 5 as well. Just because you have a certain category doesn't mean you can't send slower signals across it. Certainly, the slower signals will be able to be supported across those. But when we talk about these categories, it's not just the cable. It's the connectors on the end of the cable. It's your punch down blocks. It's your patch panels. It's your patch cables. It's your connectors that are on the end of the patch cables. It's every bit along the way. So you can't take a connector for a Cat 5 cable and stick it on a Cat 6 and expect that to be running at category 6. It's only going to run as well as it can with what you have there. Thank you, the chat room, telling me that, yes, I was right. Category 5, the 100 megabit Ethernet is 100 megahertz as well. That's not always the case, by the way. I know this goes a little bit beyond the Network Plus requirements, but just because your throughput is 100 megabits per second doesn't necessarily mean the signal on the wire is 100 megahertz. And that goes into a whole signaling conversation. But if you see those two things together, don't get mixed up. Don't worry so much about the frequency of the signal that's going on that copper. Think about how much speed is going across. That's what you'll need to know for your Network Plus certification. This is, as in the chat room, they're talking about, is this just copper? Isn't this just a copper wire? There's nothing magic about that, right? Well, that's true, but there are different types and the copper is not 100% copper. There's different things inside of the copper itself. So there is an impedance, and there's a conductance, and there's an amount of resistance you will get of the signal going through the copper at certain frequencies. So it has to be a certain type of copper that's in the cable. It has to have a certain wrap of the plastic, the internal insulation around that, and the wires are twisted together at a certain twist rate. And the different pairs inside of the wire have different twist rates. When I talk about engineering, they really go into details. And on some of the category 6 cables, there's even more insulation between the different wires to separate them so that they are not interfering with each other as much. So it depends on the cable, depends on the fiber that you're working with, but there's definitely differences between all the copper that is there. Now, category 5E came out when we came out with 1 gig Ethernet. Now, the category 5E enhanced, they called it and kept it category 5 because it wasn't much different than the category 5. Category 5E, category 5, very, very similar. There were some tighter specifications for both the cables themselves, the copper inside of the cable, the type of twisting, and additional and tighter specifications for the connectors. And what happened in the industry is we all pretty much said, well, this is almost exactly the same cable. Let's just move from category 5 to category 5E, and we'll just use category 5E for everything. That tends to be how we do it. When a new version of these categories come out, we just tend to start using the newest version, assuming, of course, that we're not going to have some type of cost difference between them. So the category 5E for a long time was the standard category that you would see everywhere. Now, if you're ever looking at a cable and you're trying to figure out, let's see if I don't even think I have a cable here that's handy, but grab a patch cable yourself. And if you look on the sheath of the cable, there will be printing on the cable, and it will tell you what the cable is. In fact, it usually tells you it's category 5 or it's category 6 or it's category 5E. And it will tell you, in fact, also a number in feet or in meters, how far down the spool that particular cable was. So you can tell exactly how far it's been pulling those things across. So there's another category you should also be aware of, which is the category 6. That is the latest, most recent category of cables. This supports 10 gigabit per second Ethernet over copper, and it does it for 55 meters in distance. Usually you only see these days 10 gigabit per second cables in something like a data center. It's not something that's really shipping on our laptops and our desktops quite yet. It's usually designed for connectivity between the different units, the switches, the routers, and the other devices that you have in your data center. Now, 55 meters is good, but we tend to standardize on 100 meters when we start designing networks. And it's been that way since category 3 and category 5 and category 5E. We've always tried to make it so that the distance we could send that particular signal to be able to support that particular speed would be 100 meters. And that's how we've designed our data centers. We've put things so that they are no more than 100 meters apart. But for 10 gig Ethernet, we might want to do more copper, and we might want to do it over twisted pair. There's a lot of ways to send 10 gig, but over twisted pair, we have a category 6 A, and the A stands for augmented. And with category 6A, we're now able to send that 10 gig traffic 100 meters and send it all the way across from one end to the other in our data center and be able to maintain those speeds, be able to hear all of the signal that we're sending on the other side. Make sure that all the devices are able to communicate without any errors between them. If you are looking at the statistics on a network device, if you're looking at an interface card that's in a server, or you're looking at a built-in network interface that's in a router or switch, there are error counters there. And if you are using a cable that does not follow these specifications and you're trying to send this signal from one side to the other on this cable, you'll notice you get a lot of CRC errors, these cyclical redundancy checks, where it's looking at the data coming through and saying, wait a second, this is corrupted. This signal did not get to me. It's like you're trying to talk to somebody over a couple of tin cans and a wire, and if you get a far distance away and that's not loud enough, by the time it gets to the other side, it can't hear what's going on. I can only make out every other word. Well, that doesn't work so well with computers. We have to make out every one and every zero. So that's one of the nice things about being able to have these standards, is that we know if we put category 5E in place, that I can support 1 gig Ethernet over those particular links up to 100 meters. Those are the types of things that become extremely important when you start designing your networks, you start putting other types of equipment into your data center, you start designing very large data centers, distance becomes an issue. And usually it's not copper. When it gets to that point, you're in a data center and distance is an issue, you're almost always flipping over to fiber, doing things with a fiber run instead of a copper. Obviously, fiber is more expensive. So there's where you start to get into some planning and designing that will have a cost effect. Should we move our devices closer together and connect them with copper? Should we maintain the distance that's already in place and connect them with fiber? That's just a number of the questions you'll have to go through to be able to design your data center and have these devices work. And that's why we have a section in the Network Plus that talks about your copper connectors, and a section in the Network Plus that talks about your fiber connectors and how you work with fiber as well. So those are very useful to have those there. So let's review some of that. One of the questions that we have here is, what is the minimum category of cable that can support 1 gigabit Ethernet? So I'm going to see if you've been listening at this point. If you go to vote.rs, VOT.rs, and you use the number 70511, or you get your QR code reader and you point it at the screen right now, it'll take you right to the vote.rs website, and you can choose the 70511 and answer the question of, if we're going to put cable into an environment and we're going to plug up a couple devices and we need them to run at 1 gig Ethernet, what is the bare minimum that we would be able to use? And of course, you have to think about all of those different pieces all the way through the line that we would be able to use with that. Not just the connectors, but everything in between. What is the minimum category? And I'm going to flip over to my list so we can interactively see what the responses are for this. And we've got a few that have come up already. A few people have said category 5. Some of you have said category 5E. Some of you have said category 6. And this is one of the challenges you'll have, of course, when designing your networks, what category of cable you put in. I will tell you that most of the time we're kind of cheating. And we're just going to say, if we're designing it new, it's going to be the highest and the best we can get, category 6A. We're just going to put it in. And you're done. You don't even have to worry about it at that point, but you aren't always in that situation. Sometimes you buy a building that already has cable in it. Maybe it's a cable that you've worked with for a long period of time, and it looks like everybody came up with the correct answer, which is category 5E, being able to support that 1 gig Ethernet going through. So a nice question that we got this week, one that I thought fit very well into what we were trying to accomplish with this. And if we go back and look really quickly, let's go through these categories. Our Cat 5, our Cat 5E was the one that indeed updates that allowed the support of 1 gigabit per second Ethernet through our network. So those of you that answered that Cat 5E, absolutely correct. Well done. And you'll be able now to sleep well knowing you at least have that particular part of your Network Plus exam all taken care of. Another question that came through was one that talked more about the DHCP process. We take this for granted, of course. We turn on our computer and it starts up and we get an IP address. We don't even think about it anymore. We could be in an airport. We can be in a hotel. We can be at school. We can be in our house. We just turn on our computer. It gets an IP address. Now, some of you, when we were talking about this week, have statically assigned IP addresses to everything. And so your static IP addresses will never change. You aren't using DHCP. But one of the challenges you have is when you plug in a device and it's configured for DHCP and its Windows starts up and the desktop appears and it says, I don't have an IP address. You have no connectivity. You're not getting to the internet. There's no way that you're able to communicate to anything. And so the question becomes, why did this not get an IP address? And maybe you go to the command line and you type in ipconfig/release and ipconfig/renew. We've done this many, many times where we say, all right, let's clear out what we got. Try again. Try to get out via DHCP to get a DHCP address out there and type in your ipconfig renew. And is it going to work? Is it not going to work? So the question is, what's going on behind the scenes? When you ask for that DHCP process, what is it going through? It's actually a 4-step process that is able to make DHCP work on your network. Let's step through what this process is. Now, I've designed a little view of the world here that has 2 DHCP servers in it. If you're in a very large environment, this is a very common thing to have, because if one of these devices suddenly disappears, you have another device that's able to pick up the slack. That's high availability, that's redundancy. Those are the things you need. Now, if you're at home, most of everything is happening in your router that you're using in your house. Maybe it's a wireless router that's connected to your cable modem, those types of things. It usually has DHCP built into it. It has routing built into it. It has NAT built into it. It might have an IPS function built into it. It has switching built into it. There's probably a wireless access point as part of it. It's a box that does everything. And so it also handles this DHCP process for you as well. So in your house, you're probably only going to have one of these. But the same process occurs every time, whether you have 1, 2, or many more DHCP servers. So here's the problem, of course, is how do I request a DHCP address? How do I request an IP address from another machine if I don't already have an IP address? Isn't this a catch-22? I'm not able to get an IP address unless I have an IP address, but I don't have an IP address, but I have to ask for one. And there's the problem, of course. So the way this is done is by sending broadcasts, because a broadcast frame has to be examined by every device on the network. So if I send a broadcast out, every device out there has to look at it. So let's see how this works with DHCP. To send what we call the DHCP Discover process, and you'll notice that it's all caps and it's one word, and I put it that way because that's how it's stated in the standard. If you go out and look at the RFC, they talk about these steps as being this one word, and you'll see it referred to that way as well. So when we look at the broadcast, the first thing your client workstation does is send a broadcast out on your network to UDP port 67 and sends it out saying, hi, I need to discover a DHCP server out there, please, and it sends the broadcast. Now, what's interesting about this in this picture is that the broadcast went to both of these DHCP servers that we see on the screen, the one here that's up close to us, but you'll notice the broadcast went right through this router and went to this DHCP server. So some of you that have been studying your Network Plus said, wait a second, broadcasts don't pass through routers. Broadcasts stay on the same subnet. They don't leave routers. And you would be absolutely correct. And if anybody in the chat room happened to know why the DHCP server suddenly on the other side of the router was able to see the broadcast, it's a very interesting process we go through for these things. The DHCP process is very unique. It's a type of broadcast that we would like to pass through a router because we're spreading our DHCP servers out all over our network. So the only way we're going to have this redundancy is if I put them on different networks, but if it's a broadcast, it doesn't pass through. So what we've done is in the router itself, we have told the router, we've given it a special command and told it, we would like you to be what we call a DHCP helper. That's a very common term for this, or a DHCP pass-through. You'll see it listed different ways in different devices. What it effectively does is say, nobody is going to allow broadcast through unless it happens to be for DHCP. For DHCP, absolutely allow that through, because that's going to be pretty important to me. So that's one of those rare exceptions, and you have to program and configure your router properly to be able to pass these through. It's not on by default, but it's one of those times where we're going to take a broadcast and we're going to send it out on our local, just pass it right through a router and send it onto our local network as well. So don't be thrown by that when you see it. That's completely normal for a DHCP to pass through a router. I've already gone into this router. I've already told it to be a DHCP helper. If you ever see a broadcast, send it through so that we're able to take a DHCP broadcast, send it through. All other broadcasts, they still get stopped at the router. All the normal broadcasts that normally go on this particular subnet that's controlled by this switch right here, represented right here by this switch in the middle, if it's just a normal broadcast, router still stops it. So by turning that on, you're not letting the world broadcast through your router, only DHCP requests. Well, now those DHCP servers, they've now understand that there's somebody out there wanting an IP address. So those devices are now going to take an IP address they have in the pool that they are managing. They say, oh, you need an IP address? I have an IP address that I would like to offer you, Mr. Client, Mr. End User. But of course, we have no way to talk to that device. It doesn't have an IP address. So the way that we do this is we send it out via another broadcast. Notice that we're sending this broadcast out over UDP port 68. So it's a different port number on the way back. So this broadcast goes out. Again, our router is a DHCP helper, so it sends it through. Now, in reality, of course, that broadcast frame also went to the other DHCP server. Everybody got to hear it when it went out. I drew my picture with the little dots here to simplify exactly the way that it would work here. But notice, eventually, they all get back to the client workstation. The client workstation hears it. Every workstation hears it, but everybody else ignores it, because that initial client workstation sent out a message saying, this is me. Here's a special ID number that I'm using to identify myself, because there may be many people asking for IP addresses. The responses, the DHCP offers that come back are offered for a specific request. And so there is an ID number that syncs those up. So the client workstation receives this broadcast, says, oh, that ID number is exactly me. Wow, I got 2 offers. This is great. I could pick either one of these IP addresses. This is fantastic. And it picks one. And the next process is, I now have the one that I would like to use as an IP address, but I'm not going to use it yet, because I now have to let everybody else know that this is the one I'm going to use, so that it can release the ones that are not being used in the pool. And so the client workstation sends out another broadcast, because it doesn't have an IP address yet, to UDP port 67, and sends it out to the specific server to tell it, you know what, I'm picking you. I'm picking that offer that you gave me. That's the one that I would like to use. That's the IP address that I think I would like to use. It got to me first. I'm going to use that one. It could have picked either one, of course, but it picked that one. That sounds good. The DHCP server says, well, that's fantastic. I'm going to send you an acknowledgement that's going to confirm that indeed I've not only sent you the offer, you have accepted the offer, and now I acknowledge that you are now this particular IP address. And again, sends it out as a broadcast across the network. Everybody sees it. And so that station receives it and is able to now, oh, good. Now we're synced up. Not only did I get the offer from you, not only did I say that sounds good to me, and I'm going to confirm that, I got an acknowledgement saying, yes, you got my message too. And now finally, I can use this IP address. So we have to go through this 4-step process every time we do DHCP. It seems like it would be very difficult, very cumbersome. It seems like a lot of work has to go into this to do DHCP. And I guess in the back side, when you're looking at the intricacies of this, there is a lot of development work that went on for these DHCP servers, but it's just 4 frames that go back and forth. Send out these, and there's a few broadcasts that go across the network. But the reality is that it works very, very easily, very quickly. It's very, very fast because it's only 4 frames. And when you finally get this, now you can set an IP address. And at this point, the client workstation says, great, here's my IP address. I've got it, and I'll just start communicating on the network like normal. The DHCP server takes the IP address out of the pool. The DHCP server that did not get an acknowledgement makes that IP address available again eventually after a timeout period. There's some other ways to tune that as well, but the client workstation is now able to talk on the network. So if you're not getting an IP address and you've done these DHCP requests over and over, you've done your IP config renew, this is what happens during the renewal process. And if it's not working, something is not working along the lines with that process. So you have to do your normal troubleshooting. Can I talk to my DHCP servers? Am I able to ping them? Am I on the network? Am I able to see anything on the network? Those are the types of troubleshootings that you'll be able to go through to be able to see that. So the question in the chat room regarding that, Jim says, does DHCP check to see what addresses are available from all DHCP servers? Well, it will certainly be able to check all of the DHCP servers that it's able to send a broadcast to. So as long as you have your router configured to pass the DHCP request through it, every DHCP server that hears that broadcast will indeed respond back if it has been configured to respond back with IP addresses for that particular subnet. This process of sending the packet through the router is one that also tags it and says this one came from this subnet. So if you're a DHCP server that has what we call a pool of IP addresses, POOL, it's a pool of addresses, and if it happens to match this subnet that's trying to get an IP address, I'm going to respond back. If I don't have those IP addresses in my pool, then I can't respond back. And normally, every DHCP server will probably have some redundancy there. So you'll very, very often get every DHCP server responding back and being able to see what's going on with those pieces. That is one of the things that is all behind the scenes. We never see it, and yet we rely on it so much. So just keep in mind that the step one, where we try to find out where our DHCP servers are, we get a response from them in step two with an offer. We respond to that offer saying, that's great. Just to one, we respond and say, that's great. I'll take your offer. I'll take that, and I'd like to request that IP address, and the DHCP server responds back with an acknowledgement to that. So quite a bit that goes on with those pieces. That's a big problem. And as Rhonda indeed says in the chat room, well, unless your pool is filled up, maybe you've got too many people on the network and now you have no more IP addresses available. Yeah, that's a problem as well, isn't it? So that's one of those things you do not want to run into when you're working with those. Well, I get a lot of questions during the week in the chat when people are online. They tell me I'm studying for my Network Plus, I'm studying for my Security Plus, I'm studying for my A Plus, studying for all these things, and I need to know what book is going to be good for me. Which ones do you recommend? And there are a lot of different books out there. I recommend always to go out, browse around to Amazon, see what's there. But there is a certain group of videos and books and sample tests that have been combined from the folks at GTS Learning that I found to be very, very useful because it's an all-in-one place. This is called Freestyle, and GTS Learning has created an environment online where all of their books are online, so you can read through every single bit of their CompTIA certified books. You can go online and take tests that they have, so you can go through a sample Network Plus exam. You can get sample tests at the end of every chapter. You can be quizzed on the things that you just read, and you've got my videos that are embedded within this online digital learning environment. So you can go in and read about DHCP and you can understand what the book is telling you. And then right there in the chapter is a test of what you learned. And right there in that same chapter is my video that's embedded right into the middle of it. So everything is in one place. You don't have to hunt around to find different things. It's really quite a remarkable environment. In fact, here's what it looks like. I've probably timed out of my presentation here. So I'm going to refresh my page so you can see this and log in again, just to give you a feel for what this Freestyle looks like. I was looking through the 005 exam information, some of the topics that were in here. We were just looking at DHCP, of course. Here's the unit information for DHCP, where we talk about static versus dynamic IP addressing, what boot P was. These are things you need to know about. There's DHCP, and there's my video right in the middle of the book. And as you're reading this and going through it, you can play that video, which you can't hear very well.
Automated ways to provide IP addressing for devices on your network.
What a good-looking fellow he is. Tells you all about DHCP and steps through some of the things that we just looked at. So that's a very, very simple way. I like that inside of all of this are sample exams. A lot of you come to me and you say, I need some exams. I need a way to look and grab sample examinations. You've got them right here. It's a practice exam built right into this. 90 minutes. You've got some grades you can go through and you can start taking them. Looks like I've attempted my quiz. I didn't do very well the last time I showed you this. So let's start another attempt and go through this again. What's also nice about this exam that's here, here's the question. You decide to deploy wireless access point and configure it to utilize an internal authentication server. What information about the authentication server must you define on the access point? So you can step through these 100 questions, which give you a pretty good idea of what to learn. What I like about this is once the exam is over, if you get it right or if you get it wrong, it tells you where this particular topic is in the materials. You can click right on it and go right to the things that you missed. So you're able to very, very quickly also review what you missed and then go learn about it immediately. Immediate feedback, immediate reinforcement. You're able to get this dynamic environment to tell you the things that you should be studying. I found that very, very useful. So if you're interested in knowing more about freestyle, I also recommend for you to go to professormesser.com/freestyle and try that GTS learning environment. They have a free sample. You can sign up and try it for absolutely free. Get a feel for what these exams might be like. Look through parts of the online experience, what might be there. You can find out more at professormesser.com/freestyle, and we appreciate GTS Learning helping to sponsor our monthly study group. Well, as we go through looking at some of these questions that come through, we have some ideas of what we need to know technically, but what about the things we need to know that are part of the exam itself? These are often some of the most challenging questions we have. I've learned all the networking stuff. I just have no idea what I'm getting into with this exam. One of the questions I saw come through this week or this month was, what concept causes the most difficulty for the Network Plus test taker? This is a very, very common question. In fact, we've answered it and talked about it a little bit on some other study groups that we did. But the idea of a single topic that tends to get people really, really in a rut are things that perhaps people are spending too much time on. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. The things that people are constantly asking about, I can think of two things offhand that people ask about. One is the OSI model. If you've never been in networking before, it's a very, very odd little thing, isn't it? This model that we've set up to determine how traffic goes through a network. OSI is a weird name to begin with, and then you have all these layers, and you're trying to take concepts that you don't even know about and try to work them into the layers of this. Normally, it takes a seasoned networking professional long periods of time, months, in some cases years, to really understand the intricacies of how all of those layers interact with each other and be able to do that. So OSI model is one that is a pretty popular one. Now, fortunately for the Network Plus exam, you need to know the basics of the OSI model, and you need to understand the responsibilities of each layer. Even if you don't quite understand exactly what those responsibilities are associated with, you at least understand the high-level view of the OSI layer. The other piece that people ask about, this is by far number one for Network Plus, is subnetting, is trying to do the math and figure out the subnetting process. Every month, I get numerous questions coming through about subnetting, about subnet masks, about subnet calculations, but I don't give you a subnetting question every month on the study group. Well, why is that? It's the most popular question. Why are you not giving us subnetting information? That's because the subnetting section of the Network Plus exam is so tiny. It is so minuscule when compared to everything else in the exam. Now, do not take this the wrong way. Subnetting is extremely important to know in networking. It is the fundamental of IPv4 networking. You will be asked and tasked with subnetting throughout your networking career, if you're managing servers or server farms, if you're working in virtual environments, if cloud computing is important, if you're managing a wide area network, if you're making sure you have encrypted connections between your site and another site, subnetting is incredibly important. But for the Network Plus exam, it's a very, very, very small piece of what you need to know. You do not need to go through the details of being able to calculate every possible scenario of every possible thing. It will help. You might get a subnetting question on your exam. You might get 2. You might get none because it's not a huge part of the exam. Now, as you go through and get other certifications, as you work towards other networking certifications that are beyond Network Plus, there will be a huge emphasis in subnetting. You will perhaps in some exams get a large number of subnetting questions. But for the Network Plus, my advice to you is if you are struggling with Network Plus and getting the subnetting part of Network Plus down, just put it aside. Understand and do the best you can, but don't waste all of your time trying to get subnetting figured out at the expense of the other topics that are on the exam, because you should absolutely know for your Network Plus all about the security. You got a huge security section to go through. You need to know man in the middle. You need to know what a buffer overflow is. You've got a whole nother section on routing protocols. You need to know what OSPF is. You need to understand what RIP is, RIP version 2. You need to understand BGP. You need to understand IGMP. You understand all those other parts of networking that if you spend all of your time working on the subnetting, you're going to miss completely. So if I had to pick the 2 sections that really cause people trouble, it's those. So my advice to you is don't get too caught up on the sections that are really bothering you. You should, of course, study them. You should endeavor to learn as much as you can about them, but don't get caught up so much that you are missing parts of the exam, that you're missing the learning that you should be doing for the other pieces. At the end of the day, you may get no questions on subnetting, and you've spent days of your life dealing with something that ultimately you're going to learn through constant use, through osmosis, through practical experience, and through other exams that you'll be taking. Another question that came through this week: what subjects carry the most weight on the exam? Often this comes from people that are about to take their exam, about to go sit for my Network Plus. It's tomorrow. What's on the exam? What questions might be on the exam? And I have to ask, have you never looked at the Network Plus exam objectives? That's what's on the exam. CompTIA is very, very good at listing out every possible thing that they try to put on the exam. Pages and pages and pages of topics that is on there. Huge amounts of detail is in these exam objectives. If you go out to the Google machine and you type in CompTIA exam objectives, it will take you right to that page. And you'll be able to put in your name, be able to put in your country, and you get to choose which exam you like these exam objectives on. And they'll give you very, very specifics, very, very detailed view of what you need to know. Oh, you need to know the OSI model? That's what you need to know. There's another piece on here. Classify how applications, devices, and protocols relate to the OSI model layers. And they give you all of the different pieces that you need to know about this. Now, one of the things that's nice about this is that you know exactly what you need to study. There are other people in the industry, other organizations that have certification exams, and I'm looking at you, Microsoft, that give us very high level. They might tell you, classify how applications, devices, and protocols relate to the OSI model layers, and that's it. Whereas CompTIA provides you with all these bullets that say, oh, you better study. Those are the things you need to know for your exam. So don't miss that on your exam. You've got tons of data here. And I often recommend that people should go out to this list of objectives, download it, it's a PDF file, and print it on paper from a tree and use it as a physical checklist. Take it around with you. Figure out which things you're a little bit weak on, things you're a little bit strong on, cross out the things you know, and put check marks next to the things you don't so that you know exactly what to study. So if I had to choose, do I study things in chapter 1? Should I study things in chapter 5? You'll be able to look at the differences and know exactly the topics you should focus on. For the most part, CompTIA stays pretty close to this objective. Now, they say in the list of the objectives that it's possible that we may put something else on here. In fact, I have it down here. It's kind of hard to read because I put it on here in sort of a diagonal, but you sort of get the gist. It says the bulleted lists below each objective are not exhaustive lists. Even though are not included in this document, other examples of technologies, processes, or tasks pertaining to each objective may also be included on the exam. So this is although an extremely comprehensive view, they could ask you something that's not on the list. Now, from my experience, I've found that's not really the case. Sometimes they might go a little bit outside the scope of some of these things, but it's very rare. You might get one question on your exam. And another thing they tend to do is ask questions that aren't part of the objectives, but also don't count towards your final score. They don't count for you and they don't count against you. So you do run into those things as well. You just have to go with what you know and pass it through the exam when you're working with it. The last question we got this month was one, should I learn how to repair a computer before I learn to network them? Boy, that's a pretty telling question. And it's one that actually, from an industry perspective, is one that I run into a lot because I work a lot with networking professionals. I work a lot with server management professionals. I work a lot with security professionals. Just because you're in networking actually doesn't mean that you know anything about a particular operating system. You don't have to know really much about the OS. You don't have to know how to swap out a hard drive. You don't have to know how to upgrade memory to be able to manage a network. It helps because ultimately these worlds do collide in technology. If you know more about more operating systems and the way they network, then you'll be able to build your networks better, those types of things. But I do talk to networking professionals, security professionals that perhaps don't have a background in operating systems or they don't have a background in hardware. In fact, the exams that I took from CompTIA, I took in the wrong direction, I guess you could say. I took my Security Plus first, then I took my Network Plus, then I took my A+. I did it in exactly the opposite direction from what CompTIA tells you to do. And that's just the way it turned out for me. There was a need for me to get my Security Plus, so I just sat down and took that one first. But Security Plus doesn't ask you anything about memory upgrades, doesn't ask you anything about hard drives. And when you work in a networking role, you will not be expected to swap out memory. You will be expected to route traffic properly through your routers. You will be expected to configure your VLANs properly in your switches. You will need to connect all of these networks together in some way. You will need to know how to set up your IPsec tunnels between different sites, those types of things. None of those have anything to do with repairing. So if you have a passion for networking, you're interested in networking, and you think maybe you don't want to go through the A+ first, you'd really like to do the network and focus on the network, fine, that sounds great. Go for it. There's no need to necessarily know how to do the hardcore on-the-bench troubleshooting of equipment to be able to handle networking. Those worlds are basically separated. But of course, as I mentioned, the more you know between both of those, the more knowledgeable, the more valuable you're going to be in whatever role you choose. So that helps as well. Our link this month, our link of the moment, is one I ran into because I was having some questions about what my device was able to do to the internet. I wanted to do some really detailed troubleshooting of what I was able to do on the internet. So the site I found, this is one I've used before, but I want to make you available to it. It's called Netalyzer, Netalyzer. This is at berkeley.edu. Netalyzer, I'm going to bring up my response. You probably don't want to run this right now because you're on this live stream and our need to be able to network is at a premium, but I'm going to bring up the Netalyzer results that I got on my particular link just so you can see what they might be. Netalyzer is a very detailed examination of what your capabilities are out your network connection. This is from the International Computer Science Institute, and they did this. It's an independent nonprofit research institute affiliated with the University of California, Berkeley, and it's a remarkable that's out there. The National Science Foundation also helped with the financing of this, and you can just use it from anywhere. I'm going to pop up my results, and you aren't able to see this on the screen quite yet because it has my IP address in here, and in fact, I'm probably just going to end up showing you my IP address anyway, just because I'm going to have to go back later and edit, so nobody's able to do any nastiness to my particular network connection. Here are some of the results that you will see. The only thing it told me about my network connection is that there were certain TCP protocols that were blocked in outbound traffic. So we can see my address-based tests, my NAT detection was working, my network interfaces were there, my NAT support is available for universal plug and play. All the things they tell you to turn off for universal plug and play, mine is on. It's for a specific reason, but I'm not going to tell you why, but mine is on for a reason. Then it did some reachability tests. Notice that it said direct TCP access to remote RPC servers over port 135 is blocked. And over port 139 is blocked. And over port 445 is blocked. And it's all about RPC, remote procedure calls, NetBIOS, and SMB. And that's because my internet service provider blocks those protocols. I can't communicate via these Windows technologies outside of my particular network connection. And they do that because if everybody's cable modem connection had allowed Microsoft protocols to pass through, there would be a lot of trouble as people were able to see other people's Windows networks, which in people's homes undoubtedly are less secure than they probably should be. So that's one of the things that you will find in here. But look at the detail here about these pieces. Now, at the top of the screen, you can even click a link that will tell you an amazing amount of detail associated with what these tests did. I'm going to try to click on it. It probably has information in here that I don't want you to see. So I'm going to bring up the server-side transcript and see if there's anything bad inside, IP address-wise, inside of these. I'm going to do a quick check for these. Oh yeah, it's got all my IP addresses inside of it. So I'm not going to show you. Well, I'm going to show you a little bit. So here's some of it here, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I will, just so you can see what the results are. Look at these results that it brings up, all the things that it's doing. And if you look at the server side, it tells you exactly the message that was sent out over the network and what the response was that came back, and gives you a ton of information. So it's not just this pretty red, green, yellow view that comes up. It shows you a lot of details on there. So a lot of good stuff to be able to see with those pieces. Now, I think if you start looking at the capabilities for that Netalyzer, you'll find that it's extremely useful to be able to use. It gives you a lot of flexibility, allows you to do a lot of different things. Before we finish up today, there are a few questions that came through. Somebody in the chat room did mention that CompTIA tends to put sample questions, sample tests on their website. For Network Plus, you'll notice I didn't mention that. And that's because the sample test that, as of yesterday, was out on the CompTIA website was for the 004 exam. It was for the older Network Plus exam. Well, we want the newer Network Plus exam. I don't necessarily recommend you go out to CompTIA and grab that sample test unless indeed you are planning before the end of August to be able to take that and do something with it. It is 100 questions, but it's now old content. And I would hope that CompTIA will get a newer exam out there eventually, one of the things to go through. There were a number of other questions that came through. Let me quickly go through a couple. I know that we're at the top of the hour, but I think I'll fit a couple of extras in here. One of the things that we talked about this week was about subnetting, and a lot of the subnetting questions that came through. There is the DHCP that we talked about. A lot of wireless questions come through as well. One of the wireless questions that I often get is about security of our wireless networks. If you recall in the Network Plus exam, you're asked a lot of questions about securing a wireless access point, even more so on the 005 exam. And we talk about things like MAC filtering. We talk about static IP addressing. We talk about SSID broadcast suppression. And those three capabilities right there are not really security capabilities. If you ever see a question that talks about how to secure a wireless network, the answer is always going to be encryption. Always, always, always. And it's always going to be WPA. You may see it listed as WPA2 encryption. If you ever see a question that says, oh, we need to secure, do I do encryption? Do I do this through SSID suppression? Do I do this through being able to have MAC filtering? Do I set up static IP addresses? What's the best way to secure that wireless network? Encryption. Your answer will always be encryption. So I saw that question come through. And another question that came through from Judy was this whole idea of virtualization. As we all recognize, virtual networking is in virtual environments, virtual servers, being able to virtual server farms, being able to take a server and move it to a completely different geography instantly and have everyone be able to use that virtual server, now moving it to a different place, giving it more disk space, giving it more memory, adding more CPUs dynamically and shifting it down again. That's what everybody's doing these days. So every environment that I walk into now is all doing virtualization. It doesn't matter where I go, whether you're a big organization or small organization, you're going to be doing some type of virtualization, and especially of the servers and the environments that you're using. The question Judy has is, what's the impact that this has on network traffic? What problems should we expect to see because of this virtualization? Your Network Plus requirements don't go really deep into this, but it's an interesting problem for network professionals because you may have servers that exist in a particular data center that instantly may be moved to a data center on the other side of the world. So all of the network traffic that normally went into one data center now has to go to the other data center. And so you have to plan for these types of eventualities. You have to make sure that you've built a network connection going in and out of that data center, that you have the core of the data center designed for these environments, because you never know exactly what you're able to expect. We used to build our data centers knowing exactly how much traffic would be going in. Here's exactly what we'd expect to see. Maybe if we failed over from one data center to the other, it could be twice as much. We'll build it out with that. Now, who knows? There was an environment I was in talking to some folks over the last week that said, we have these campaigns that go out. We manage a server for a very popular website. And when that website has a campaign that goes out, suddenly we get a huge amount of traffic coming in all at once. He blasts out an email, suddenly tons of traffic. So it's predictable, but now we have to build the network out. We had to make that virtual machine a little bigger. We have to now make sure our network connection can handle that. Do we have multiple servers in a load balancing environment now that are handling that? Do we have the network traffic to handle it? Those are just some of the concerns we have to deal with when we talk about virtualization. So that was a good question that Judy sent in regarding those pieces. Well, we've come to the end of yet another Professor Messer study group. I'd like to make sure everybody knows that if you'd like to follow what we're doing here and see the latest announcements we have for the study groups and anything else that we're doing, you can follow us on Facebook at professormesser.com/Facebook. I send out questions every day for my A+, and I also send updates every now and then on different things that I find that are going on professormesser.com/Twitter. I'm trying to be a lot better about sending out Google Plus updates. So if you're on Google Plus, you probably saw this one this week as well. And of course, all of my videos can be found on the Professor Messer website and also on YouTube. You can see my channel there at professormesser.com/YouTube. You're more than welcome to go and subscribe there. Every time I upload a new video, you'll get a message saying that's exactly what has happened. Also want to remind you to look at what GTS Learning is providing. You can find out more about that at professormesser.com/freestyle. And of course, thanks to all of you. We wouldn't be able to do these study groups without you watching the videos, without you attending the study groups, without you supporting what we're doing here. And we're awfully thankful for everything that you give to us as well. Thanks for joining us this time. We will see you next month on the Professor Messer Network Plus Study Group.